Let me also just say on what you said, Chairman, in the introduction about Greece and Spain soon leaving. I think this is very much sort of what is being thought of in the market psychology. I think in reality it's not going to happen for either of them, and if one only Greece, but we can always discuss that later on. I think what the Western world needs now, and I could have shown you a lot of slides here, is actually to try and return to growth paths, because we were used to in the 90s to basically grow 3% per year. We are now growing much less than that. Some of us are, as I said before, in a recession. And I just don't see how you can get out of a debt and deficit situation and begin to create jobs before you start growing. So for me, it's very much about growth, and this is not just because the French president has taken up that subject, because we were actually saying that very strongly from our think tank already last year. And I think most of it is based on my own personal experience, because most of my life I've been in Greece and my bank has been in Germany, so I've always been spending more than I actually could. And every time I came to a crunch point like now, I always thought it was much nicer to get a new job and a higher pay to get out of the debt than beginning to sell out of the Lamborghinis and the Ferraris, which by the way I never had. But anyway, the thing is, growing, if you return to growth, then debt and deficit becomes a much smaller issue. And what I was hoping for, and which I will hope for as the last hope actually in this term for the June summit, is that the EU leaders, first of all, will begin to talk about growth at least as much as they talk about austerity, number one. Number two, that they actually do something about it. And I think there is an economic bazooka that will be fired. Not that I think that individual countries have a budget surplus that they can spend, but commonly we can do it. There is questions about increasing the capital of the European Investment Bank, which could then relate, for example, to SMEs and warm up some of the credit freezing that we have around. There's the question of a large amount of unspent structural funds in the EU. If you don't know what it is, ask a question afterwards, but we talked about something like 85 billion of EUROZONE spent here, mostly in countries in the south. And the third thing is, and I want to avoid any misunderstanding now, is that we have a new concept called Euro project bonds, which is really about commonly finance to the markets by issuing bonds, large infrastructure programs in Europe that we can't do with public finances at the moment. And I actually am very, very angry with the leaders of Europe that they couldn't at least come up with a plan like that, accompanied also by some positive messages. Because I think there's a lot of things we should do before we enter into discussions of changing the present treaty, and I'll come back to you in a second why that should happen. As opposed to the Euro project bonds I just talked about, which are concretely designed to finance particular infrastructure projects, there is a discussion also about Euro bonds. There's something completely different. Eve has already talked about and actually advocated the use of the Euro bonds, which basically means that you are pooling together the bonds from all the Euro countries. It may sound as a good idea in particular from those that have high lending or borrowing costs at the moment. It doesn't sound so good for Germany, but it will not happen because it is simply, it will be the lead to federalism, but it will not happen simply because the German Constitution prevents it. It can only be done, and will only be done by German support if we at the same time introduce the full economic union to supplement the monetary union. And I also think it would be an incredibly bad idea, because the thing is that if we do that, it's not only a question of the interest rates, but it's also a little bit like giving a credit card to your 14-year-old teenager. Because it actually means that countries, for example, in the south, could just start spending without it being hurt over their borrowing costs. And I'm pretty certain that Germany will not allow it, and I will argue against it as long as he will defend it. So we can do that later. Another issue is the European Central Bank. A lot of people are saying, why don't they just print money? Why don't they just do like the UK and the US? And there, by the way, is my main explanation why we're not talking about, for example, sterling prices at the moment. It's because the markets are nervous. And they're not nervous when sterling, when the Bank of England basically said we'll print whatever money it takes. But we all know that this has in itself a really, really big risk in the future, which is called inflation. And I think that's the main reason why we don't do it. And the Germans had a trauma here, because that was what happened in the 20s and in the 30s. They don't want to go down that route. And therefore, I think that the limited way that the ECB has been supporting the markets is the right way, because the unconditional printing of money, I think in the end, will not only be a bad idea, but it's also a way to avoid doing structural reforms necessary. I mean, what I see very much in the US is that their political system is incapable of dealing with their debt. We've seen that time after time. The Congress can't agree on anything. They prolong short-term agreements, and the Fed is basically pumping out the money to support the non-decision making in the US, and the same goes very much for the UK. So what I see for Europe here is very much the economic risks that we've been talking about, but I also want to mention the social risks here, because the issue is that with the unemployment that we're seeing around in the Western world, in Southern Europe in particular, we have not only big social issues here, but also issues that could actually lead into a more conflicted situation. Because I don't agree that war cannot come out, or civil unrest cannot come out of this situation. Because if you, for example, like in Spain, have 40%, 45% of the young generation that doesn't have any prospect for jobs and so on and forth, I am actually surprised that right-wing populist parties are not fishing around in those waters. I'm actually surprised, and I live partly in Spain, so I know it's not taking place, that nobody is advocating the good old days on the Franco where we didn't have unemployment and all those kind of things, if you understand what I'm saying. And I think what we can be really happy about is that Germany has been doing so well during this period, and that there is not a little man with a moustache in the south of Germany saying the things that the Dutch right-wings or the Austrian right-wingers are saying at this point in time. I think we can be happy that there is a sort of a feel-good factor in Germany, and also a deep support to the issue that we're dealing with here. But let me end up by saying, and agreeing with you a little bit on this, and disagreeing probably with Eve about this thing about the federalism that you said we had. My opinion is that we do not have federalism in Europe, not besides the monetary issues. Because we still have a situation where anybody can just say whatever we just agreed in Brussels. We have now, with our own local democracy, taken a decision that we will not agree to this, which the Greeks, for example, might do, and you can step out of it. I mean, you don't expect, for example, Texas or Nebraska to take that decision in the US, where you have the pure federalism. You might see that in the United Kingdom. We can discuss that with Scotland, but it's not something that just happened because this election is a long-term process that you're going through. So I don't think we have a real federation here. We will not have it until we also have, let's say, a real political system incoming, which we do not have at the moment. And obviously, this is an issue of legitimacy, as you rightly said. I think to justify and to give the legitimacy that everybody's looking for here, we need to have that federation. But I also think, on the other hand, it is not going to happen because the voters of Europe don't want it, and there's no way you can sell it. So I think we're stuck in an incredible dilemma here. I'm just saying, if we could turn the tide, if we could turn the psychology around this whole thing, I think the present crisis could be at least relieved for a certain point in time, and it might go somewhere else, by some leadership that actually advocated growth as much as austerity. But let me say it's about high time, because if you look at the demography of Europe, you will actually see now that we have a very rapidly aging population, we have a low birth weight, we have a lot of aging, as I was saying. We have a European model which is based on the welfare state, which we don't really want to get rid of. We've already seen a lot of sharp reactions during this crisis, but we'll have to work on that in the next 30 or 40 years because of Europe's demographic situation. So it's not just a question of a short-term fix, it's really also a question of a more long-term way of working. Do we want to do that together, or do we want to be individual? That is a big question, to be individual. Thanks.
I think you're right that there is, in some forms of pure sort of finance, there is an increasing move towards federalism, the European governance of domestic economies. But it recently is saying, and going back to the drachma, or the new drachma, would allow it some more flexibility in 2 years and things like the success. Will that be seen as the unraveling? That other countries will say, we don't, again, look, Greece may look like a disaster now, but if get some flexibility not to be part of the EUROZONE and to grow on its own accord? Does that to end the political enterprise?
This is in the Greeks. People had, they would vote on the 5th of June, and then they have to say, when they have to identify a government first, and then we'll see if the government is okay to go on implementing some adjustments which are very violent on the one hand and which are very slow on the other hand, which for the population is very difficult. And in exchange of the solidarity which has been granted to Greece, Ireland and Portugal are specific cases. Why is that? Because they have lost part of their sovereignty the day when they lost their solvency. Sovereignty ends where insolvency starts. So they are in a relation with the EU, which is peculiar in nature, because the EU is acting as the IMF, and alongside the IMF, by the way. So with a conditionality put to force Greece, I would say, to act better. It's a peculiar situation because Greece is a very small country, with a very small debt in reality, if at the European scale, a very small GDP. So Greece helped the Europeans to, I would say, to have to take very difficult decisions in terms of bailing out, for example, because this was not only not planned, the bailout, but it was excluded. It was even worse than not planned. It has been discussed 15 years ago, and it was excluded. And then a lot has been made for Greece. They just have to go on implementing some reforms. Maybe there is a problem in the pace of the reforms. Maybe they should have had more time. The direction is this one. The asset of Greece, I would say, is that if Greece was to exit from the Eurozone, this would create the precedent, and then it would be a signal saying that, well, you can go out and go in the Eurozone as you wish. If it's Greek people's choice, then this will be done. But if you look at the polls, the Greeks are totally in favor of staying within the Eurozone and within the EU. So there is a contradiction. If you look at the option you've mentioned, Brexit going away from the Eurozone, well, I'm not an economist, but I read that it would not ease the Greek situation in 2 years' time. There are examples, such as Argentina, right after such move, going out of, if not a single currency for Argentina, but a fixed rate dollar. In this case, the situation was totally horrible. So, I don't know, but I would say that there is this contradiction by the Greek people should be clarified at the mid-June. We'll see this. There is a profound rejection of the two principal parties which rule Greece and which are responsible for the situation.